Welcome to Redbeard Radio. I'm Brian Keith, and today we have an expert on sensemaking, which is the most important tool you've never heard of. Sensemaking coach Michael Guimarin, who you can find on Twitter at Mike Guimarin, is an expert on the intentional process of understanding, which, if that sounds a bit nebulous, we're going to dive into exactly what that means and why it is critical for you in your business and in your life to get a better handle on how to better understand information. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Brian. Glad to be here.
Now, we have a hilarious example of not understanding what's happening where we actually started this interview and I did not click record the first time around, which I've never done before, but I didn't accurately perceive what was happening. I assumed that I knew it was true. Why? Because it's always true. I always click record at the right time. I never click it at the wrong time. And yet what I knew to be true just wasn't true, which is an excellent entry point into getting better at understanding what is actually happening.
Yeah.
So can you give us a description of what sensemaking is?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I try to think about sense making as a process of intentional understanding. And the reason why we talk about it in those words is because most of us have some kind of grounding in what reality is, and how we interpret and process information is something that we've developed over the years. And it's something that we've observed in our parents and other teachers and mentors that we've had. And unfortunately, because of changes in the media environment, because of changes in the way that information is distributed, a lot of those processes that we take for granted actually don't help us anymore, and in many ways can be exploited or even hurt us. And so the entire idea of sense making is let's revisit those processes. Let's be intentional about how we're going to apply them so that we can have an understanding about what's happening.
As you're talking, what came to mind was a high school pep rally where everyone's in the bleachers and there's cheerleaders and drill team and whatever and we're all singing songs about how we're going to win and they're going to lose because we're better than they are. And in the years after high school, I've thought, how terrible is this that we are training ourselves that we're just better. We're more valorous. We always get more points. And that really, it's not necessarily true, right? Maybe our team isn't as good as their team this time. And yet we were indoctrinating ourselves to believe, because of the colors I'm wearing and the name of the animal that I call myself, I'm better and I'm going to win. It wasn't true then. And in retrospect, it taught us to think poorly because it taught us to think more about, I'm going to identify with my tribe and that's how I'm going to make sense of the world. Because I'm a cougar from Capitol High School, I know I'm better than those Olympia Bears over there.
Yeah, it's an interesting example of how we coalesce around a common story or narrative. And, we can deconstruct sort of how that plays out, even in sort of the red hats and the blue hats in society, but it really breaks down in any which way.
Well, I'm reminded of other stories I tell myself at different points in my business about what do I do. I had a time, it was last summer, about a year and a half ago, where I had been doing one business model and I thought of myself as this is the kind of thing that I do, which was one-on-one coaching an hour every week or two. And I had a particular price point and a particular lead flow. I had this image, this mask. Here's who I am. Here's what I'm doing. And then some things happened where I lost some clients in the area. And my girlfriend, now my fiance, incredibly smart human, said, well, what if you weren't doing that? What would you do? Who would you serve? How would you serve them? Such fundamental questions. And yet when she asked them, it broke through that image that I'd adhered to and said, this is who I am. And I thought, well, that was what I decided in the past was good. What would I decide now is good? And the answer is quite different. And it's led me down this incredible path where now business is better than ever. But it really came down to losing some clients at the right time. And then my girlfriend at the time asking a really good question to sort of wake me up from this dream of what I perceived myself to be in the business sense. What are some questions that you found in your sense-making coaching that help wake people up?
It's interesting that you say, what are some questions? Because a lot of people that come to me, they have this experience where they're going along just fine, just as you were. And then there's some kind of shock. And for every person, it's different, the way that it manifests. But the underlying story is that they realized that some institutional group was basically gaslighting them for their own personal gain. and to their detriment. And then they ask the question like, okay, like I really believed in these guys. I believed what they told us about coronavirus. And now I'm seeing that they weren't being truthful. And so then that kicks off a question of, well, how can I understand what's happening in the world around me, in my business, in the media, in my family? And, eventually they come to the concept of sense making, at least some of them. And then there's, some of us who try to teach it and help them out. Like, how do you reconstruct a reality in our new media environment?
I love the example of coronavirus. We're recording this at the tail end of October 2020. And at the start of the pandemic in the US, people looked like me like I was a crazy person because I was wearing nitrile gloves when I went shopping. My girlfriend didn't enter a store for a few months. Later on, I was wearing a mask when no one else was wearing masks. And people thought I was nuts because all their information sources said, this is not a problem. And certainly a guy who's switching out different nitrile gloves between, like actually properly doffing them before getting into my truck and then putting on a new pair for the next store, that was insane.
Totally.
And then at some later point in the year, that appeared to be not insane. And so as I've been interacting with people, because it's been a pretty hot topic this year, at times people thought I was crazy in one direction, then they think I'm crazy in a different direction. And we just don't know, like even not to dive deep down the rabbit hole of what is happening here, but we don't actually know even now how coronavirus gets transmitted. There's some cases to believe it's actually a transmission of fecal particles. And some other cases think, well, it's actually airborne. And there's really smart people saying both these things are true.
Yeah.
And I'm not an epidemiologist, and it wouldn't help if I was, because the experts are completely disagreeing about the basic building blocks of reality.
Correct.
So how in the world, if I can't know something that specific, that there ought to be a truth out there, how can I know what product to market next month? Or should I have 3 emails or 4 emails in a campaign?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, right? I think part of the reason why so many people, including the experts, are having difficulty figuring out ground truth is because we just simply have so much more information now that the ability to filter the signal out of the noise, it's just not there, even for people that are supposed experts in a field. And so what I would advise you to do in your client work is to focus on things that you know for sure, right? And some things that you know for sure are that your clients are going to have generally the problems that you advertise for, they're going to have those problems, right? And you know that if you can convince them that you solve those problems, that's good. But as to the specifics about how you go about doing that, it is really born from your own observation, your own trial and error.
Yeah. I'm thinking about a client I'm working with right now where one of the questions is, which email makes money? Because most of the time, most software doesn't yet track, at least not if it's not at the enterprise level, it doesn't track where is the money actually coming from. Maybe you can see this campaign made $1,000 yesterday, but you can't see that the first email made 900, but only the text links. The second email made nothing, and the third email made all the money from the gift you had in your PS line. We just don't track that mostly at the small and medium business size level. And so we don't know, we guess. And for this client, I was saying, we should go start tracking the stuff. Here's the system I devised to do it, but don't get bogged down because you can also get way too much data, like you're saying with the signal versus noise, that we can track how much money comes from PS links, but maybe we don't need to know what exact detail. We need to know the right amount of detail. And that's really hard to know what the right amount of detail is in any kind of question.
Yeah.
What does your sense-making work have to tell us about how to even know what the right level of detail is for any question?
Sure. So I think the way that I tend to look at this is because in my other professional career, the one that really pays the bills, I talk to a lot of clients about big data. So even large Fortune 500s have the same concerns that you and your clients have, which is basically that there's too much data, there's too many KPIs, and they don't understand what to focus on. And so the way that I like to think about it is you have data, and data would be, it was sunny on Monday, it was raining on Tuesday. And then you have information, which is a summary of a set of data. And then you have insight. And at each level, you're reducing the amount that you have. And so the question is, when you're collecting information and collecting data, what insight are you hoping to glean information on or some kind of perspective on so that you can make a decision in your business? And to the degree that the insight doesn't help you or make you change an action that you're already taking, it's probably not worth tracking.
I love it. I had a client once who had a problem because his company had been in the news, and it was a company that their donations are greatly affected by how much they're in the news. And he found out a couple days later when he was looking at the stats that there was a huge spike in traffic. And the tech guy said, "Oh yeah, we knew about that." And then he found out that they'd been in the news. But the prime time to put up new advertising, test out new things was in the middle of this traffic spike, which he was unaware of. So I built him a tool where if any day is 3 times as much traffic as the normal day, or any week is twice as much traffic as the normal week, he gets a text message because he needs that information at this particular moment that there's a traffic spike happening right now. He can't wait. If you wait on this information a week or even a few days, it gets way less valuable.
Mm-hmm.
And so it helps him ignore the data most of the time, but only when it actually matters and he can take action does he get a text message.
Exactly.
I'm thinking about where we go from here. If we all accept that there's too much information and what we want is insight, not just data, as we're about to walk into 2021, how can a person organize their information diet better to nourish them and help them just advance their lives and really move forward? And as you say on Twitter, building the future that they want to live in, as opposed to feeling deluged.
Yeah. It's a great question. And I think there's a couple of things that I would say. The first one is, like you said, right? Basically, to summarize outside of just your business, if you're coming across a new piece of information, you should really only respond to that piece of information if it's going to change an action that you're already taking.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, for example, you may read about an explosion in Beirut, but if it's not going to change an action that you're already taking in your daily life, it's really not worthwhile to respond to that information. Because what's going to happen is you're going to spend mental energy either being emotionally upset or actually like arguing with someone on the internet, which we've all done. And that's not going to help you get closer to your goal. And in most cases, you don't have the ability to affect the outcome there. And so it's wasted energy. So that's number one. Number two is when you're looking at the sources of information that you have, whether it's a newspaper or the television or even Twitter, ask yourself, what is my intention by consuming this information? Being informed is not enough. You have to decide like, okay, I'm following this person on Twitter because I want to get better at this aspect of my business. And this is how I'm going to track whether or not I'm better because I have an understanding of the state that my business is in, where I want to be, and the gap, right? So it's a metric that I'm tracking over time. And you don't have to be like super precise about this and make an Excel spreadsheet, but even just asking the question, like, am I intentionally or passively consuming information? That will have a world of difference because it'll allow you to cut down on so much signal that's not helpful.
What was number one again?
Number one is only pay attention to information that's going to change an action you're already taking.
Great. And number two is think about why you're consuming the information, right?
Exactly. Just like you would with food.
Wonderful. So for everyone listening, think about one person you are listening to, whether it's a Twitter account, someone on Facebook, Redbeard Radio, for example, whatever, and stop for a moment and think about how are they helping you change your actions? And if the answer is they aren't, then that's interesting. And the second thing to think about with that particular information source is how intentional are you being about it? And then also, I think we covered this in the class that you taught. Would you miss it if it was gone is an interesting one.
Definitely. And of course, you only really know until you mute it, right? What I'll do is I'll write an Excel or something like that where I list a bunch of Twitter sources that I've unfollowed. And then if I don't notice in a few weeks or something that I cared, then I just sort of delete those guys.
Uh-huh. Well, I'm actually, for folks listening, I'm at the tail end of a month with no Twitter and no news, which came out of taking Michael's Sensemaking class. Not that he said, you should do this, but what you taught Michael about information diets and the conversations with the other students got me thinking a lot about how to clean up my own life. And there's some ways in which I'm very careful. Like I have a great light diet. I wear different colors of glasses depending on the time of day, if I'm looking at screens or not. I try to get outside a lot. We only have salt lamps on at night. I'm very, very careful. And yet I was realizing I was not nearly as careful with my information diet as I could be. And I think that it's just a fascinating concept that you brought there. So with Twitter, back before this month where I've been on Twitter not at all, I would, instead of just going on Twitter, I would save the direct URLs to Twitter people I wanted to follow, and then I would go through my bookmarks. And every so often, once every month or two, I would delete almost all of them to get myself back down to 10 or less. 10 or less places I was going to go out and reach for information. And that includes webcomics or anything else. And it was interesting because at times I had more news aggregators, and other times I'd have more individual people, and then I'd delete them, most of them, to get down to less than 10 or less. And then I would see as the list grows up, because I think, oh, I want to listen to this person. I want to listen to that person. And it was not always the same people. There was some that were very consistent. But then a lot changed, where apparently what I was really curious about just kept on changing.
Yeah, I think this is great, right? You're being intentional. You've just experimented for the last month in an elimination diet or a fast, right? But in an information context. And so now you're seeing how your body, or in this case, your mind, is responding. And I think that's great. That kind of experimentation is necessary and helpful for us to grow.
I am shocked about how much news I'm still getting through a few groups I'm in, because I don't have extra time, mind you. Now, a month ago, September and earlier, I'd occasionally just go be on Twitter for an hour, hour and a half. Maybe I'll take a 10-minute break from work, and then an hour and a half later, right? After reviewing all these problems, which most of them I'm not going to take action on, per your earlier point. And I haven't had extra hours and a half in my day this last month. So clearly I'm doing something with that time that I was not getting to do because I was choosing to be, well, a consumer, but also a product of these things that go and sell me as advertising eyes, right?
Exactly.
And then there's also the cost of the information coming in. That one of the most notable things immediately, and folks, I live near Seattle, so when you're reading about all of the street violence in 2020, a substantial portion of it was either to the north in Seattle or to the south in Portland. And I realized, wow, when I got off Twitter, my consumption of seeing acts of violence went down by 98%. Well, what does that do to my brain? And some of that I was going to take action on in terms of thinking about what are the actual threats in my environment. So I wasn't just purely being a voyeur, but I'm now consuming vastly less violence. What does that do to my brain to not see actual people hurting each other? I don't know, but I think it matters.
All the research would indicate that seeing less violence in your media environment is a good thing.
It's wild.
Because we are primed to respond physiologically to violence. That's why it's on the news.
It's the most important thing.
Correct.
Yeah. I was at my grandma's house, and my grandma watches lots of news, mainstream network news media. And whenever I'm exposed to network news, after a few minutes, I am anxious. And I feel it in my skin, my shoulders raise up, I clench my muscles, and I can notice, oh, this is a fight or flight response. Because what's being thrown at me is death and doom and devastation. And I feel under attack after only 2 minutes. I can feel it.
Yeah.
And I think, oh, my grandma, she's just exposed us this every day.
Yeah, I was going to double click on this. You can run this experiment for yourselves, folks. But if you go on a mainstream news media network like CNN, the typical pattern they have are 3 negative stories in a row, followed by a positive story, followed by a commercial break.
Yeah, it's crazy. I read about this in Gary Vaynerchuk's book, Jab, 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 Right Hook, where he talks about how in your marketing, you should have 3 more engagement things followed by a sales pitch. That's his rhythm, and that's generic. He goes into details on different media. And then I think it was after I read that book, I was at my grandma's house watching TV, and I thought, wait a minute, I can't tell the difference between NCIS reruns and the network news. They blend together because they're exactly the same thing. It's just one is less fictional than the other.
Well, at least you believe that.
Yes. It was this amazing, like, oh, I'm being programmed. I'm not actually relaxing exactly. It's that NCIS, which I loved watching because it's with my grandma. NCIS is this, it's pulling me emotionally here and there. And then the news comes on for 5 minutes. And it's this, I'm just being pulled in every different direction.
Yeah, right. And one of the core things to developing your sense-making practice is asking the question, where is this media that I'm consuming? Where is it pulling me? Right. So Netflix is trying to pull you into the next episode so that you binge watch. CNN, to an extent, also Fox News and other perspective-based news media is all about selling you advertising. Right. So imagine that you're in that fight or flight response, and then you have that 30-second ad, like what your brain is doing in terms of accepting or not accepting the information.
Yeah, because if we're anxious, we want to solve the anxiety, and most products are pitched as this will solve your problem. So if you're really unhappy because a child died in some horrible way on the other side of the world, then even though buying this next toothbrush will not bring that child back, it feels good. We want to have to be filled up with goodness, with some kind of wholesomeness. And so if I can buy this car that will make me look better, or this toothbrush, or this service, then I'll feel whole after I've been ripped apart a little bit by being exposed to trauma.
Exactly. Yep. You hit the nail on the head.
When I was in search and rescue, I learned a lot about this thing called a stress injury, which I never grew up hearing about. I had some awareness of PTSD, that what we called shell shock back in World War II is now understood to be PTSD. And there's a huge study of it and how to deal with it. And there's a very small scale version called stress injuries, where in search and rescue, occasionally you encounter stress injuries where it's as if you had a broken bone, except it's not a bone that's broken. It's essentially it's your soul or your mind in some fashion. And it was this really big shift in my thinking to understand that it's not about being tough exactly. You climb a mountain, that's about being mentally tough and about being physically tough. But when you encounter a stress injury, sometimes the right answer is to say, wow, I recognize that I've been damaged. I need to seek professional help, just as you would if you broke a bone.
Yeah, I think it's exactly that, right? We have this concept of, I'm going to shift it back to food because I think it's a little easier.
Yeah.
But you look at someone and they look unhealthy because they're eating donuts every single day, or their skin doesn't look particularly great because they're eating a lot of processed oils.
Mm-hmm.
In a lot of ways, the media that we consume does the same thing to us. So if we consume too much of a certain kind of media, suddenly we become lethargic. Or in the case of a repetitive stress injury, imagine that you're, in a war zone, you may get PTSD from consuming a certain amount of media that's in a particular way. In your case, you removed the violence and you're wondering if that has a net positive effect. Well, you're not exacerbating, that addiction to violence, as an example.
Yeah. I want to do two things. I want to do an information diet exercise for folks who are new to this idea and maybe want to try a little taste. And after that, I want to hear about how people can get involved in this sense-making process with you. So first off, information diet. In the class, we spent a lot of time on information diet and diving into all these different methods. But what can we do in a minute or two, including the folks who are right in their cars right now, just driving and listening as they're driving? What's a good beginning to really thinking about and then an action step for an information diet overhaul?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one that you did, even though it's drastic, is very interesting for folks, right? So, but what I would suggest is cut off your phone or Twitter or a particular kind of information for the first 3 hours of the day once you wake up, and then pay attention to how your body feels after. If you're like most people, the first 3 hours of the day are your most productive and you're going to feel great. Do that over a week and it might end up becoming a habit.
I love it. I'm going to give some more specific examples, and folks, just take one of these and try it and see what happens. Turn off notifications on your phone for a particular app. Maybe for all apps. Like right now on my phone, if you text me, I don't see it. I see it when I'm looking at my text messages, because I already had most apps turned off for notifications. And then I went and did it for my last few. And now, yeah, I occasionally miss something timely, but not very often. Mostly my phone is not trying to talk to me and tell me anything. So it's wonderful. For folks who are on Twitter, consider grabbing the direct URLs of your 10 favorite people and just go to those. Bookmark them, go to those instead of looking at your Twitter feed. With Facebook, grab the people you care about the most, grab the groups you're most involved with, bookmark all of them, and stop going to Facebook. Just entirely stop going to Facebook.
Just delete Facebook.
I got it off my phone, and that was a really good thing for me, which I use it for work all the time, so it's scary because I got to be connected. Well, actually, there's a handful of groups that I really care about, that I want to be really involved in. It's easy to bookmark those. It's not difficult. It's just I want to have the more information. That's part of the dopamine hit, right? If I know more information, I'll be happier. That's not true in the slightest, but my body keeps on thinking it's true, despite years and decades of evidence to the contrary. So, folks, try any of these information diet things to get a little bit of sense of how you could change your life through a better information diet and deploying some of Michael's sense-making tools. And Michael, if folks want to go learn more from you about being their sense-making coach and diving more into these ideas, what is the best path?
Yeah, I think today, because I have very limited scale, which I'm working with Brian on to grow, basically what I would say is go to Twitter and follow me at Mike Guimarin. And then over the next few months, I'm going to put in some things that allow me to teach more than a handful of people at once. And then you can learn more. And then, of course, I'm going to be dropping sort of the rationale and some of the basic theory around, why we have to do this process in an intentional way now, as opposed to, 100 years ago, we didn't have to be as intentional. We could just trust, hey, if it's in the newspaper, it's probably true, which is not the case today, unfortunately.
I love it. When I am off my Twitter fast, which happens in 3 days, do you know what one of the first things, and maybe the first thing I'm going to do is?
I have no idea.
I'm going to consume an entire month of at Mike Guimarin at once.
Oh, nice.
Because I typically would have you, but you only tweet, every day or three, unlike some people who tweet 100 times a day, right? As I've noticed, what am I missing? What do I actively wish I was listening to? Not just in a theoretical sense, but actually I have a craving, right? For this perspective, because I feel like it adds to my life. Your Twitter is one of those information sources that I've actually been actively missing, which tells me something. Because of the, I don't know how many dozens of Twitter feeds I bookmark, I don't actively miss most of them. And so it's going to be really interesting to get a go and scroll on down to October 1st and then walk up through history over the last month.
Yeah.
It's going to be fantastic.
I like that idea.
Well, we never do it, right?
No.
We like with Netflix binging a show and enjoying the entire story. But in Twitter, we have all these little disjointed bits. Facebook the same way, Instagram the same way. So I want to go enjoy a chapter of what you've produced. And folks, the place on Twitter, it's at MikeGuimarin. You will not regret the investment of your energy going over there. Michael, thank you for being on the show. And thank you for that great sense-making class that you taught. And we'll talk again soon.
You're welcome, Brian. Thank you for having me today. I really appreciate it.